Hello everybody, James here from Q-SYS in the UK, and I'd like to tell you about the latest version of Q-SYS Designer Software version 9.8. As ever, we've got new product support, new software features, and much more. So let's take a look at what's new. Let's begin by taking a look at support for new hardware in Designer 9.8, starting with the SPA QF series, which is essentially a QLAN version of the popular SPA power amplifier. It also includes flex channels and GPIO, which makes it the perfect peripheral to pair with a Core Nano. Now, in addition to new hardware, we're also supporting additional modes for existing hardware in 9.8. And you might remember from my 9.7 video where we talked about peripheral mode for the Core 8 Flex and for the Core Nano. Now, in 9.8, we're adding support for peripheral mode for the Core 110. So if you do have a need for a high-density I/O expander for any kind of Q-SYS system, maybe with redundant networking, you can now do that with the Core 110F in peripheral mode. Next, let's take a look at some new software features, which includes Designer Search and Replace, secure WebSockets, UCI variables, and a few other surprises as well. Let's take a look. Another very handy feature in 9.8, especially if you're working on larger designs, is design-wide search and replace. Now, this lets you, just like you'd expect with find and replace, this lets you search for anything you like, but instead of it just looking in scripts, for example, which is where you'd find and replace before, this can now search everywhere. Now, in this particular example, I've got a divisible space. I've got room 1 and I've got room 2. And a lot of these inventory items are actually labeled room 2, room 1. But this particular company have now decided that they want to label these rooms correctly. They're not just called room 1 and room 2. So I'm going to go into search and replace it. I'm going to search for room 2 in the way that I've used it. And you can then see that it's going to come up with all of the labels and all of the inventory item names that use that. And now I could replace it. And let's say that this company is naming all of their meeting rooms from famous children's TV characters. So we can put in a new room name there and hit replace. And now we can see that every instance of room 2 has been changed with the new room name. Now, similarly, this works with signal tags, for example. So here we've got TV on, TV standby. But let's say the integrator in question here has now got some new naming conventions that they want to use across the whole of the commissioning team for things like signal tags. They don't want to see ST by here. They want to see the word standby. And again, we can just hop into search and replace, and we can say replace that with standby and just hit replace there. So it's going to be a huge time saver. Particularly if you have design templates, you'll be able to really easily reuse those, change those to be used with different systems and different naming conventions. Another new feature in Designer 9.8 is the Lua WebSocket client. Now, this has been requested for a little while because it lets us connect to many more third-party devices for Q-SYS control, which use WebSockets as their preferred connection method. Now here we've got Q-SYS Designer open with a Lua script, and we also have Sockets Bay, who do have a test WebSocket server that anybody can connect to and try and send messages. Now if we come over to Q-SYS, we can see that the way we would actually use this WebSocket is kind of similar to how we would do a TCP socket in earlier versions of Designer. So we can say websocket.new and call that WS, and now we're connecting using the URL for Sockets Bay, which you can see there on line 4. Now, if we restart the script, we will see that we get a successful connection. So let's try that now. And immediately you can see that it prints WebSocket and it prints connected, because on line 7 there, we've got a connected function, and part of that connecting function is to print connected. The other thing it does is write the word hey, and we can see that that's been received by the server. Now, we can also send data back to Q-SYS here. So we have the function for data, which is going to print the data. So if we send hello Q-SYS from Sockets Bay to Q-SYS, we can see that that has printed in the Q-SYS debug there, along with a few other people who I think are sending some messages to the same server. So do check out the help file for all the documentation on this and have fun using WebSockets. Here we're going to take a look at the new UCI variables feature in Designer 9.8. Now here I have a beautiful user interface with a very nice gradient and some faders. And what I'm using is a little bit of simple CSS to set the color of these. And the way I'm doing it is with this root section here. This is where you can create variables in CSS and then use them throughout the CSS later on. And this has been around for some time. And you can see I've got color primary, color secondary, and I've also got a fader color variable. And then to make this gradient, I'm using the page, putting in background image linear gradient, and in there we're essentially using those variables, color primary, color secondary. And then the fader is using fader color. So that's nice and straightforward. That's using CSS, which we've done for a little while. Now here, next to our layers section, we've got a section called variables, which is new. And this, a bit like how you create controls now that relate directly to the UCI, now you can create variables which relate directly to the UCI. And really the intention behind this is that you could have a template UCI with the same code, the same basic layout, but then you could use variables to make changes to it for different implementations of that template UCI. So let me give you an example here. We've actually made some variables in here with the same names as the variables in the CSS. And this means that this will give us the option to change our CSS while the system is running, simply by editing these variables. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to emulate this design right now. And I can go into where it says color primary here, and I could change that to something else. Let's make that blue. And now you can see that that has actually linked with our CSS variable, and it's now changed that here. So maybe I'm using template CSS with a template UCI, but I have a different customer I want to use the UCI for. I could quickly change this for some different brand guidelines for a different customer. Okay, and we can change the fader color as well. And there we go. Looks very nice. Obviously, I'm not a graphic designer, but you know, there you go. Gives you an idea of how this might work. Now, also, we're using variables here in a different way with this channels variable. So if we look inside the code for my UCI, I've got 4 faders on here, and it might be that my UCI template has 4 as the maximum, but maybe some rooms that I'm going to use this in have 3 faders, some have 2, some have 1, perhaps. And instead of me having to go in and manually delete those faders every time, we could just adjust this channels variable to do it at any time. So to do that, I've got some fairly simple Lua code where I've got my faders into a table. Okay, so controls.gain 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the actual name of these 4 controls. And then I'm saying that whenever I change the channels variable, so UCI.variables.channels.event-handler, whenever there's an event on that variable, I'm going to loop through these faders and make them invisible if their number exceeds the number set in the variable. So for example, right now, if I change this to say 3, it's going to go through and hide number 4. If I set it to 2, it's going to hide 3 and 4. So I can easily adjust the number of channels for that room without having to actually, delete items from the UCI. I can just simply have variables here. And I'd like you to go to the help file for Designer 9.8 where there are several other examples and videos and walkthroughs. Okay. Another new feature in Designer 9.8 is the new Save to Core and Run dialog box. Let's take a look. So this new dialog box, instead of just telling you what's currently happening, it gives you a history of all of the communication with the core and what's being done with the firmware, with the design file. And if you do have redundant cores, you will see 2 instances of this at the same time, one for the primary core and one for the secondary core. Next, we've got additional controls for alerts and notifications from Enterprise Manager. Starting with email notifications, you can now control whether a certain severity of email triggers an email notification at all. So for example, you might want to get emails about errors, but not about warnings. You now have the ability to control that. In addition, we've added particular controls inside Q-SYS Designer for errors relating to HDMI sources. Now, these types of sources can sometimes throw an error which is technically correct. When, for example, a PC goes to sleep, you've still got 5 volt on the HDMI, but there's no valid video format. And you will be familiar if you've used Enterprise Manager with those kind of devices. You might see an error saying there's no video format detected, which is correct, but you don't really mind because you just know that PC's gone to sleep. Now, on that actual HDMI source component, you can trigger the level of alert you want for that particular thing right inside Q-SYS Designer. We've also added new filtering options in Q-SYS Designer Asset Manager to filter between the types of plugins that you want to use. So you can now filter between Q-SYS Ready technology and Q-SYS Certified technology, which is plugins that have been developed alongside the Q-SYS engineering team. Additionally, we have a new tag for Q-SYS Reflect Enabled, which is plugins that are designed to work natively with Enterprise Manager. I'd also like to mention the latest updates to the plugin library on Asset Manager. So for example, we have the new BrightSign digital signage player plugin. We also have a new plugin for the Televic Confero conferencing system, which allows you to control that system and the microphones within it as well. And some new bug fix updates to the Sennheiser wireless and Shure wireless microphone plugins. We're adding new plugins all the time, and since this video gets made, there's probably been some new ones as well, so do continue to check the Asset Manager for all the latest updates. Now, as is always the case with a Q-SYS Designer software release, there's far more in it than I have time to talk about in this video right now. So do check out the release notes for yourself, have a look at the online help file for more detail, and of course, download the software and have a play with it. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Enjoy Designer 9.8.